So what do we make of all this? Could we see a world with fewer coal-fired power plants? Joining me in the studio is Mihaela Carstei, Deputy Director of the Energy and Environmental Program at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've been here before. You know, just a couple of years ago, there was a lot of concern about nuclear power in light of what happened at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. So now it doesn't seem to be as dire. Has technology changed, or do you feel that the world is just becoming more comfortable with the idea
of nuclear power? I feel the disaster of Fukushima was a little bit of a blip on the radar. It was sort of a perfect storm of the worst case scenario. If you look at the long-term trends within nuclear power, the safety history that nuclear power has shown both in Western Europe and throughout the world, really, it's fairly safe. So people are just sort of going back to that paradigm that nuclear power is acceptable, especially in light of climate change efforts. It's a carbon-free source of power. So I think its advantages are starting to show a little bit more.
There's some video I'd like you to take a look at. There was an incident that happened on Friday. There have been all sorts of protests against fossil fuel. So dozens of activists from the environmental group Greenpeace say that they were held at gunpoint by the Russian Coast Guard. And it happened just after two members of the group made it onto a oil drilling platform in the Arctic to protest drilling. Those campaigners say that they were beaten, and we see cases like this all around the world, people upset over drilling for fossil fuels, including oil. The advocates admit, though, that it's still a grassroots effort because the industry is still very powerful. So the question for you is, what will it take to move past fossil fuels for energy?
I would like to rephrase that question. I don't think we can move past fossil fuels, not in the near term. Yes, we can make advances in alternative sources of energy, in energy efficiency, and we have seen tremendous advances throughout the world, in China, the US, Europe. However, moving past the fossil fuel world in the next 5-6 decades is not very likely.
Not very realistic.
Not very realistic, especially when we have to deal with the poverty issue. We have 1.6 billion people without access to commercial energy, and you have them in Asia, Africa, Latin America, actually throughout the world. And the question lies, how are we going to have a prosperous, peaceful, stable, global society when we have those kind of numbers in poverty? And the only way to bring them out of poverty is to give them energy, clean water, and help them develop economically. So to do that, you need a very diversified portfolio. You need to use everything while minimizing the negative impacts. I'm not saying it's a wonderful thing we have to use fossil fuels, but I'm saying we do have to account for the negative externalities and take those into account when developing new sources of energy.
Well, let's talk about some new sources of energy and alternative forms of energy. What are some pros and cons when we look to those sources?
So when you think, let's say, renewable sources of energy, solar, wind, the cost is the one issue that's always being brought up as a deterrent. There are sources of energy that need subsidies, but if you look historically, most sources of energy required subsidies or government support to get to the level of development where they're commercially viable.
Because it's expensive.
It is expensive, but it's also expensive to continue building the way we're building. We haven't yet accounted for the cost of climate adaptation. If we are not going to take any sort of action to either lower our carbon emissions or from fossil sources or move towards carbon-free sources of energy, we will have to incur those costs and costs of adaptation to climate change, to extreme weather events. And it's going to happen maybe not tomorrow, but for sure in the next decades. And we can already see general trends. Secretary Moniz actually mentioned this on Wednesday, where, well, we can't attribute a single event to climate change. We can definitely attribute the increase in extreme events. The trends we are seeing are out of the historical patterns.
So let's look ahead to the next 10, 15, 20 years, and especially at the regions that need energy the most, these developing areas, South America, Africa, parts of Asia. What do you see for them as the demand grows?
In terms of sources of energy, well, it's going to be highly regionally based or country based. It will really depend on the kind of resources those countries have. This is where maintaining a diverse set of energy resources and employing new technologies like the carbon limits on fossil power generation will help the global situation will help countries around the world, even though this looks like a US-based policy at this point, it will help countries around the world be able to choose from a diversified portfolio that suits their development needs while also minimizing climate impacts.
All right, Mihaela Carstei, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much
Thanks
for your
for having me.
perspective on this ongoing issue.
Thank you.